This on? Yeah. Testing. Testing.
Testing.
Okay, thank you for coming to the final Climate Emergency Institute press conference, coming from Madrid, United Nations, COP25. We just heard the young people team before this one saying that COP25 has failed them yet again. So our last one, the latest news on the climate emergency, is the extreme weather emergency, and we thank the Biberman Foundation in Ghana, Africa, for supporting us. We have entered, or rather we have been pushed by big money, big corporations, and power-mad governments into the age of climate destruction. This age will not cease, it will get worse. We have entered an unprecedented age of global climate destruction and accelerating climate change, as we heard very recently in the COP from the World Meteorological Organization. Even so, there is no change from the fossil-fueled world economy driving the global destruction. Increasing extreme weather events are the most damaging category of impacts to both human populations and crops. The IPCC, by the way, includes forest fires in that category. I'm just going to very briefly show you two headlines of the top two latest shocking headline-making climate change science publications, and our experts will talk and explain more about the science. First one, headline from the University of Oxford, December the 9th, global food production at risk from large atmospheric waves in the jet stream. Massive heat waves occurring across several major northern hemisphere agricultural regions, the best regions on the planet, at once, simultaneously. That's what we're facing. And this can also lead to the opposite, further south of the jet stream, with extraordinary torrential heavy rains and destruction from flooding and landslides. This is what we're in for. Number two headline, new regional accelerating feedback from Arctic ecosystems already underway. That's from the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, their annual Arctic report card of December 2019, just released a couple of days ago. Also, the Arctic has switched from a carbon sink to a carbon source, and 2019 average air temperature in the Arctic was 1.9 degrees C. So I'm just going to pass on now to Paul Beckwith, who will be able to tell you more about that science.
Okay, so let's let Regina say a few words first.
Yes, thank you so much for those headlines, Dr. Carter. And though I'm sure most of you watching and most of you here know him and he needs no introduction, I will go ahead and introduce him. So that was Dr. Peter Carter, who we just heard from, and he's a retired physician who's practiced medicine for almost 40 years and is now devoting the rest of his life to climate science. He's also a founding director of CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and is also the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute in Canada. To his right, we have Paul Beckwith, who has an engineering and physics background and teaches climatology once in a while at the University of Ottawa, and he's currently working on his PhD in abrupt climate change, which is something that we seem to be facing more and more. And then to my direct left, we have the esteemed Dr. Peter Wadhams. He is the author of A Farewell to Ice, a report from the Arctic, and professor of ocean physics and head of the Polar Ocean Physics Group in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics, University of Cambridge, and is currently teaching at University of Turin, I believe. And with no further ado, we'll hear from Paul Beckwith.
And yourself, Regina?
Thank you so much. My name is Regina Valdez, and I am a climate reality leader and also a Green Faith Fellow, member of Buddhist Global Relief, and climate activist. Thanks.
Okay, so, you know, what to talk about on the last official day of COP. I mean, first of all, we know it's a bit of a farce. I mean, if you talk to any of the parking attendants or any of the, working in this big convention center, they're all working tomorrow, right? They know that, no agreement's being reached, and, it'll go down to the wire tonight, and they'll say, well, we're getting close, but we need an extra day of negotiations, and, they'll repeat the same thing tomorrow, and about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock tomorrow night, we might hear, well, we're getting very, very close to a breakthrough, and, at 11:59, they'll sign an agreement saying, basically, not too much, but they'll claim it as a big improvement over previous agreements, a big breakthrough, and, it'll be COP 25 COPs and still squat, really, because the metric that's really important is the level of greenhouse gases, specifically CO2 in the atmosphere. I mean, if you look at that curve, measurements have been done since the 50s and 60s on Mauna Loa and on the mountaintop in Hawaii, and those CO2 numbers just keep going up, and they're going up at accelerated rates. Now, it's common for a rise of about 3 parts per million in 1 year, whereas before it was, a few decades ago, decade or so ago, it was 2 parts per million was the highest, and any decade before then it was 1.5 or 1 rise. So that curve is still accelerating upward. So until we turn that curve, stop that curve and turn it around, all of this talk at these agreements and so on is just talk. So what I want to talk just for a few minutes before getting Peter Wadhams' views on some of his Arctic expeditions. But it's interesting that I don't know, quite a few years ago now, there was a meeting of some people in the UK, including John Neeson and Peter first, and they started this group called the AMEG, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, and I quickly heard about it and joined, and so did Peter Carter. So, we've been, talking about this sort of thing for many, many years. But one thing I wanted to just point out, the emphasis is we've got lots of scientists working on specific pieces of the climate issue, but we don't have enough people that are looking at the overall picture and joining the dots and connecting all the different components of climate. Beyond studying climate, chess is a passion of mine, and I look at the chessboard, I look at scientists as the individual pieces working, on very limited domains. You might have a glaciologist specializing in one particular glacier in one part of the world, knowing everything about that one could possibly know, whereas another person is working on atmospheric physics and another person's working on soils, and there's no, we're very specialized, we're very compartmentalized in science, and we need more people, we need more chess players as opposed to chess pieces and squares on a chessboard. We need more people who are looking at the connections between the squares and the pieces, and it's not the pieces that decide how to move. Somebody's directing the overall picture, looking at the big picture. So that's all I try to do, try to join the dots on the climate system, how it's changing, how quickly it's changing, and where we're heading. So not to talk too much, the basic elevator pitch is we're getting tremendous warming of the planet because we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. And through greenhouse gas, what chemical components there are in the atmosphere. We've changed the way the atmosphere and oceans respond to heat, so that the additional heat that is being trapped is causing warming. The warming is highly non-uniform. So high elevation mountaintops are warming twice as fast as low elevation. Land is warming twice as fast as ocean. The Arctic is warming 4 to 5 times faster in the high Arctic than lower latitudes. The reason the jet streams exist is because the Arctic is cold, the equator is warm, and as the Arctic warms like crazy, it lowers the temperature difference to the equator, so the jet streams slow down and become wavier, they become stuck in place. So extreme weather events increase in frequency, severity, and duration. And the other thing that's key is right now the center of cold in the Arctic is basically, slightly offset from the North Pole towards Greenland. But in an Arctic without sea ice, the center of cold will be Greenland itself. Center of Greenland's it's shifted. It's at 83 or 73 degrees north latitude is the center of Greenland, which is 17 degrees shifted from the North Pole. So it makes perfect logical sense that the jet streams in a world with no Arctic sea ice will be centered around Greenland, and thus will be completely offset. So not only are the jet streams slowing down and becoming wavier, but they're going to change location. We rely on the jet streams for our existing weather conditions, and when the jet streams are in a different place, then we'll have to relearn how and where to grow food. So clearly, it's pretty logical that there's going to be global food shortages very, very soon when there's no Arctic sea ice. So these things are just kind of obvious if you really think about them. So anyway, I've gone on long enough. Thank you all for attending. It's been a very interesting COP. Hopefully, we get a tipping point in human understanding of the risks from climate change, and then a tipping point in how we act to address these problems. Hopefully, that can't happen. It should have happened yesterday and last week, day before, but it'll happen now. I think, maybe is Greta a catalyst for this? We'll see. We hope so. Okay, so I'll pass it over to Peter, who I just met for the first time. We've been working for, it seems like forever, and we just met in person yesterday.
Well, thank you. I've been asked to add a few words about, specifically about ice, and a couple of the interactions with ice that are affecting our present climate emergency. I should add that we've just seen a very, very moving talk by Stuart Scott about the person who's doing the most to destroy our planet at the moment. That's President Trump. And I have sadly to say that as of today, there's a new kid on the block that Britain has just had the idiocy to elect Britain's Trump as Prime Minister. That's Boris Johnson. So we sadly now have two nations run by lunatics. Ice.
Have you seen the movie The Joker?
Yeah.
I just feel like now Britain, it's not a clown, we've got a Joker in charge, right? Who wants to actually destroy the country, it seems, to outsiders.
Well, sadly, that seems to be the case. Anyway, get back to ice. Two of the large foundations that are concerned with ice problems, that's the Healthy Climate Alliance in the US and the Climate Repair organisation set up by Sir David King in Britain. Both of them have stressed the importance of bringing back Arctic sea ice as a separate item in their manifesto. So you're trying to bring back Arctic sea ice sort of independently of cooling the planet as a whole. Now, the question is why and how can we do this? And the first question is why, when obviously you expect ice will come back if we can manage to cool the planet. But the two of the whys that are really been identified in reports in the last day or two, in fact, concern the impact on methane emissions and on the Greenland ice sheet. The Greenland ice sheet, it's fairly simple what's happening. That is to say, with sea ice retreating in the summer now, Greenland, the island of Greenland, is now surrounded by open water, and that brings a much higher air temperature than you would get in the old days when you had ice around Greenland all the time. And that warmer air now causes melting all through the summer of the entire surface of the Greenland ice sheet. And I was up on the ice sheet on August the 1st this year, and that was a day on which there was more melt than any other previous recorded day in history since they started doing measurements, and that was 12.5 billion tons of ice melted off the Greenland ice sheet in one day. All of that ice goes into the ocean, and that increases the rate of sea level rise. And as Peter said, sea level rise is now occurring 7 times or rather, Greenland ice sheet melt is occurring 7 times as fast as it was a few years ago, and that means sea level rise, for which Greenland is largely responsible, is also going to be increasing at 7 times the rate, which is bad news for the inundation of the coastlines around the entire planet, both cities and rural districts, especially regions where there are poor people living who can't afford to raise the heights of their flood defences. That's the first one. The second one is methane, and again that was the subject of a report very recently, and that's because one of the big sources of methane emissions at the moment or in the future may be the Arctic Ocean itself, because the Arctic Ocean the sea ice is retreating, and that's leaving a huge area of the Arctic free of ice in the summer, and that's an area of shallow water where the water, if there's no ice there, the water warms up, and that warmer water has an impact on the seabed. It melts out a layer of permafrost, which at the moment sits on the seabed protecting us from what lies underneath the seabed, which is a very large thickness of sediments that are full of methane. So that methane, which is at present combined with ice, can be released if that seabed permafrost melts. The methane comes out in big plumes, and that gets into the atmosphere, and as Stuart has shown, it has an impact which varies from 20 times as great as carbon dioxide to 90 times as great, depending on how you measure the timescale. So this is a very, very potent gas. It's already being released in increased quantities. We're seeing plumes of methane coming out of the Arctic seas during the summer. They're increasing, and the fear is the whole permafrost layer on the Arctic seabed will just melt away, and at that point a massive release of methane will take place, which has been calculated that it could cause easily 0.6 of a degree of temperature rise, more or less immediately, something I don't think the planet could easily stand. So these are reasons why we should be specially aware of sea ice and the need to bring it back, even if we're not capable of cooling the climate effectively. We should pay special attention to bringing ice back. And there's a big problem and a challenge, because we haven't got a good way of doing that. There's a way that has been proposed that they think will work to some extent. That's marine cloud brightening, where you release finely divided water particles, seawater particles, into the bases of clouds, marine clouds, and that makes them brighter, and that makes the area locally cooler. So you can cool, according to our models anyway, you can produce some local cooling that will allow sea ice to advance to some extent around the edges and bring some of it back. But that is not what you really want, which is to bring it back so it covers all the marginal seas of the Arctic in the summer. That's a much harder job, and I just personally, I don't know how we can do it. There's been some fanciful ideas advanced about pumping water over the ice, but I'm very dubious about their likelihood of success. So I think here's an open question for scientists still. Can we find a way to bring back Arctic sea ice, even in advance of finding a way to tackle global warming, which the best way would probably be, or certainly would be, to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That will bring the climate under control. But we need urgently to actually cool part of the world, that's the part around the Arctic Ocean, so that we can bring back the sea ice and not have it do all the damaging things which it's already started to do. So that's a problem with Arctic ice, and why the foundations who are trying to get something done are focusing on ice as a separate item from all the rest.
So Peter, I have to ask you, I mean, you've been studying the Arctic sea ice from looking up above, from sonars on nuclear submarines, on many expeditions. You know, were you ever really concerned about your life on any of these expeditions? And, you know, what was it like? I assume it was very noisy in the submarine as it's crashing up through the ice, coming to the surface. Like, so what would be the first, most memorable experience you've had on one of these submarines? Or maybe you can't talk about it, it's classified.
No, I can. In fact, I talk about it in my book. It's normally quiet and very comfortable, and but first of all, it's very claustrophobic, because nuclear submarines never come up to the surface. Old-fashioned diesel ones did, to charge batteries, but nuclear submarines like to hide under the ice, and that makes for claustrophobia if you're not a professional submariner. But one that I was on had a real emergency when there was an explosion on board, and two of the crew were killed, and the submarine nearly was lost. So that made you suddenly realise these are not safe vehicles for going around in the Arctic. I noticed, again from Stuart Scott's talk, he had one of the frightening images that makes you afraid was Mike Pompeo making one of his idiot speeches. And he's most famous for an idiot speech he made to the Arctic Council earlier this year, in which he said that China was threatening the whole world by putting cargo on ships going through the Northern Sea route, and that this threat had to be withstood by America by adding more to its nuclear strength, and submarines and icebreakers and troops and everything in the Arctic. We have to defend ourselves against China, which is threatening us by sending cargo through the Northern Sea route. And so that means there'll be more nuclear submarines in the Arctic, patrolling around, accidentally hitting each other or having accidents which can result in loss of life. So I'm not a fan anymore of submarines in the Arctic. I think there are better ways of doing it.
Right. Peter, did you want to make a few comments? Got it.
I just want to reinforce that the reasons that Professor Wadhams just mentioned, that we have to do what we can, and we have to maintain the Arctic sea ice. We have to. Our very survival depends on that. And the reasons are that we have now entered another age, another terrible age, which is the age of Arctic multiple feedback, runaway global heating and climate change. This is what many of us decades ago feared and believed would never be allowed to happen. So in the Arctic, we've got these enormous sources of feedbacks to global warming which accelerate global warming. Permafrost is emitting, and NOAA has just acknowledged that we are now into a feedback situation. This is the first time that a scientific organization has acknowledged we are in a feedback situation. With the Arctic switching from a carbon source from a carbon sink to a carbon source, and emitting. The Arctic is emitting permafrost, and the subarctic wetlands, they're emitting more methane, far more carbon dioxide than anybody anticipated, and they're emitting nitrous oxide. So nothing could be worse. Nothing could be worse than the situation we're in with respect to the failure of policymakers and governments to realize that the Arctic has to be protected and the Arctic sea ice has to be maintained, conserved. Instead, these idiots, and we just saw an example of it in the last, from Stuart Scott, his last excellent presentation. These idiots are talking about benefits to the planet because the channel from Asia over to Europe and the United States will be opened up.
Yeah.
So they're doing, and their policy and their aim is exactly the opposite to what we have been talking about for decades.
Right.
Has to happen. We have to keep that Arctic sea ice.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to point, my last emphasis point is basically that, everybody knows about climate adaptation, that term, and right, same thing with climate mitigation. In fact, the IPCC has volumes on each specific topic. We need to get climate restoration as being the third leg of the stool, if you like. We need whole chapters and we need people working on climate restoration. How do we restore a healthy climate? And I think, anyway, thank you for coming, and we'll just let Regina say a few words to close out.
Sure, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for everyone for being here. It's occurred to me as all of you on the panel are talking about climate disruption that we actually, and I don't know if people on the feed who are watching this can hear the disruption that's happening down the hall, and that's with the youth of the world shouting to make their voices heard. And it's very impressive to me that they are quite voluble in this manner. And also, as you're talking about climate disruption, I'm talking or thinking in my head about climate distraction, which is that so many people are distracted. People are on their iPhones, people are on their computers, people are either on Facebook or they're taking photos and videos for Facebook. Virtual reality is about to amp that up even a huge, much bigger level. And what I'm wondering is, you have so much information. How is it that we are going to attract their attention when people are able to live in a life when virtual reality is even more preferable than analog reality? So I think this is a very important issue. And yeah, thank you so much. I learned a lot from all of you. And my big wish is that all of the information here can somehow reach the youth out there.
Thank you.